everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is chair of our Republican legacy, former Congresswoman Barbara Comstock. Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining me.
Good to be with you.
It is good to have you, and it's really good timing because this is an off-election year, but one of the races we are keeping our eye out on is the Virginia gubernatorial race. A new polling out from Roanoke College this week shows that the race is in fact tightening. Democrat candidate, former Congresswoman Abby Spanberger, is currently ahead, though, of Republican Lieutenant Governor Winsome Earle-Sears. So to start off the conversation, what are your thoughts on the state of the race?
Well, on the entire race, Abigail Spanberger has been ahead, and the incumbent Lieutenant Governor, Winsome Sears, who is running for governor, has been, way far behind. And while this poll this week showed it a little closer than previous polls had, apparently this poll this week, the Roanoke poll, was using turnout numbers based on the 2021 election, the Glenn Youngkin race, which was, a Republican good turnout year, which obviously was during, the Biden administration. And, usually what you have in Virginia is reacting to whatever is the party in power, which obviously this year you have Donald Trump back in power, and Virginia's history with Trump in the presidency is not a good one. I can tell you that from personal experience. First of all, when he came into office in 2016, the Virginia state legislature had a supermajority in the House, and I think we were about 60, somewhere between 65 to 67. By the time Trump went out of office, they were down to 47. So between the 17 and 19 elections, it was a total wipeout. Ed Gillespie lost when he ran for governor, even though he had been a very promising candidate and had almost beat Mark Warner for Senate in 14. And then we lost three House elections, three House seats in Congress. So including Dave Bratt, who had beaten Eric Cantor, and he was thought there's no way he can lose. That's a very safe red seat. And that, in fact, is the seat that Abigail Spanberger won. And even though people, went after her, not in 20 and 22, she has been very resilient and won in a swing district, which is why she has been such a strong candidate.
Like you said, to your point, Virginia is a really interesting state because Biden won there in 2020 by 10 points. The very next year, Republican Governor Glenn Youngkin then won. In 2024, though, the Democrat turnout was different. Harris did win by 5 points, though. Do you think that means anything right now about the governor's race today?
No, I think she actually was, Harris is a little closer to 6. But again, I think there was some issues in terms of the war, in the Mideast. You had a lot of some concern there. Maybe turnout wasn't what it should have been, and of course there wasn't a lot of focus on Virginia as a swing state, so the turnout wasn't the way it might have been when there was more focus. But Donald Trump has lost Virginia in 16, in 20, and 24. He has consistently lost districts like my old district by double digit. And that pattern continues. And when you look at areas now in the Richmond area where the suburbs are growing, that's the growth area in Virginia, those suburbs have turned more blue. And again, that's the area where Abigail Spanberger first represented. Her district has changed over time, but that's an area where she has been fairly strong and appeals to those suburban voters. And in her campaign, she's been very focused on sort of the kitchen table issues, things like, the cost of living, which, if you look at the poll, Donald Trump is in the high 30s, maybe. Cost of living, cost of housing, inflation, all those things that Donald Trump ran on that won him the election that people were concerned with Joe Biden about. A year later, or less than a year later, people have those same concerns. the cost of living, kitchen table concerns, and those haven't been alleviated. So, not surprisingly, Winsome Sears is not running on those issues because you can't run on those issues when none of those issues have been solved. And it's been reversed. And Abigail Spanberger is able to run on those. Hey, day one, we were going to get, we were going to solve inflation, we were going to solve cost of living. And none of those things have been resolved. And you have a very big impact of all the firings from Doge, where Winsome Sears has made some big gaffes, kind of saying, hey, everybody loses jobs. What's the problem? And that has been a real gaffe. And then you have a huge money gap between the two. And then most recently, you've had the endorsement of the police, which usually goes to Republicans. And in fact, the lieutenant governor running on the Republican side and the incumbent Republican attorney general, who's considered the strongest of the three Republican candidates, they both got the endorsement of the police. But Winsome Sears did not get it, and Abigail Spanberger did. So that's a uniquely, a big deal for Abigail Spanberger. I always got that endorsement. Most Republicans do. I think on the in the delegate races, most of the incumbent Republicans are getting that endorsement. Even some of the ones in swing districts are getting it. So the fact that Winsome Sears, who actually got that endorsement, as did Glenn Youngkin 4 years ago, she didn't get it. That's a pretty bad sign for what's coming up too. But overhanging it all, I think the biggest problem for the whole ticket is the Trump effect.
I want to talk about that a little bit more because according to this recent poll, Winsome Earle-Sears is down by 7 points to trailing Congresswoman Abby Spanberger. But the other Democrats running for lieutenant governor as well as attorney general, they're ahead, but their Republican counterpart is just behind them by 3 points. Why do you think there's that disparity? Do you think it's because Winsome Earle-Sears isn't the best Republican candidate? What do you make of that?
Well, she has not been a good candidate. But again, you do have that, what you see in Virginia, whereas, 4 years ago, you had, Glenn Youngkin was able to run against Biden and have that impact. That was a very close race because you had, a former governor, Terry McAuliffe, running against him. But you had that bad economy going on. Glenn Youngkin was a very engaging candidate. He had a money advantage. He beat Terry McAuliffe out a little bit in the money. So, he kind of had the wind at his back there. And I think you have the same kind of thing happening now. That Trump is a big wet blanket on Virginia, both on raising money. He's hurting the down ballot races and the delegate seats. And he's, the lieutenant governor and the attorney general. Well, actually, the attorney general on the Republican side is doing the best. He's doing best at fundraising. Lieutenant governor does not have much at all money. But I think because these days you see so much party voting and you don't see too much ticket splitting, the indication seems to be if the top of the ticket goes by more than 5 or 6 points, the whole ticket probably will go down together, is the expectation. And certainly Abigail's been running more than 5 ahead in all of the polls. And you haven't even begun to see the big spend that you're going to see after Labor Day. And I think her money advantage is up to about 3-1 right now.
I feel really lucky in the sense that I've been able to talk to other of your colleagues on our Republican legacy, and the general sentiment I get from the former senators and members of Congress is that they want to bring the Republican Party away from MAGA, away from that movement, away from Trump, and back to more Republican ideals. From that perspective, I mean, how do you view this race? Does that mean you're supporting the more moderate Democrat, Abigail Spanberger? What does that really look like for you?
Well, I am. I've gotten to know Abigail. She's won, She's been noted for being an effective legislator. She actually won an award that I won when I was in Congress for being one of the most effective members of Congress, passing sort of bipartisan legislation that she worked on with Republicans. Like I said, she got the police endorsement, and she voted against Nancy Pelosi for speaker several times. That's she stood up against her own party, something that Republicans in Virginia, like I did often, are willing to, used to be willing to do with their party. But in the era of Trump, you have to go along with whatever he says. And with the Doge cuts attacking so much, not just the federal employees, but in Virginia, you have this whole ecosystem of our federal contractors, our national security infrastructure, our veterans. A third of those Doge cuts are veterans. And so we have a huge veterans population here, not just in Northern Virginia, but all throughout Virginia, down in Virginia Beach. And so these cuts have been a huge assault on our veteran population.
I do want to talk about those Doge cuts and how much they matter in Virginia, because a lot of the people who reside in Northern Virginia, they're federal workers. And when Lieutenant Governor Winsome Earle-Sears was asked about if she embraced Doge cuts, she said, we don't want anyone to lose their jobs. She empathized with people who did lose their jobs, but she said Virginia has over 250,000 jobs open. What was the response, do you think, in Virginia to that type of answer? I mean, what do Virginians want to hear?
Well, she also said, which has been effectively already used as an ad, hey, everybody loses their jobs. And the problems that are available in Virginia do not match the job skills of those who are losing their jobs. And so first, it's not just that they're losing federal employee jobs, they're losing federal contractor jobs. Veterans are losing their jobs. So, for example, if you're a veteran, a third of those jobs are veterans. So if you're a veteran who's losing your job at the VA, there's not necessarily a replacement job in Virginia for that. If you're somebody, say, who's a specialist in national security, there's not a replacement for that. If you're a researcher at NIH living in Virginia, there's not necessarily a replacement for that job. Virginia has a lot of the jobs that they had on their website were things like at nursing homes, retail jobs. That's if you're a GS-15 at the NSA, you're not going to go work at a nursing home or work at Tyson's Corner. So the replacement jobs have not matched in any way comparable. So that was seen as a pretty flippant response. And the mismatch, Virginia does have one of the highest unemployment rates and job loss rates in the country because of Doge. And the Doge cuts have been they weren't surgical, they were a bulldozer. So to not have our people standing up for us. Listen, when I was in there as a staffer, when I worked for Frank Wolf, people like George Allen, previous Republicans would stand up regardless of party when the president came in and went after our government employees. That is different now because these Republicans are afraid to say anything against Donald Trump. People notice that. Your first obligation as a representative is to represent your people, not Donald Trump. That's been the message that Abigail has said. Because Abigail has said, I stood up against my party. I voted against Nancy Pelosi. I was the most bipartisan member in my delegation, in my caucus. I stood up when it mattered. Winsome Sears and these guys aren't doing that. That's something that resonates. I found when I ran, because I was willing to stand up against my party, people appreciate that because that makes a difference for their jobs. And it's also about national security and about the importance of the work that these people are doing. And you're recognizing that their work is important, whether it's curing cancer at NIH, which, Republicans, Newt Gingrich was leading the charge on that. Now that's been decimated. So people say, whoa, wait a minute. You Republicans were telling us you wanted to do that. Why are we decimating that office? And as somebody who voted for all those increases in the first Trump administration, I'm saying, yes, that is insane, and that nobody from our Attorney General to Winsome Sears is saying, hey, you can't do that. That was voted into law. You can't cut those grants without Congress doing something, and nobody's standing up for that anymore. So that's the kind of thing that I do think resonates here in Virginia, and people realize this is a really different time, and I think that's having an impact.
To that point, is this a Republican Party today that you recognize as someone who served in Congress as a Republican? And I mean, is there any Republican you look to now who you would like to be the standard bearer of your party going forward?
Well, I look at somebody like Governor Kelly Ayotte, who had a great reputation when she was in the Senate. And now, as governor of New Hampshire, she is governing looking out for the best interests of her state. And I think that's a great model that we need in Virginia. And particularly when you're running for governor, you really need to be focused on these things, not looking to Washington and what Donald Trump wants you to do.
Part of the reason why Glenn Youngkin was able to win in 2021 is, aside from shoring up that Trump conservative vote in Virginia, he was also able to peel off a lot of the suburban vote as well. As of right now, whose message is resonating more with that suburban vote? Is it former Congresswoman Spanberger's, or is it Lieutenant Governor Winsome Earle-Sears?
Well, like I said, it is very much right now the focus is on that cost of living issues. And while last year during the presidential election, those issues went to the benefit of Republicans, now, as you see, inflation is still going on, the cost of living is still high, housing costs are high. Spanberger has been going out and putting out plans on all of those issues, whereas actually the National Review, a conservative, online, magazine, just reported how Winsome Sears is not on the campaign trail much. She's not putting out policies. So these kitchen table cost of living issues that 4 years ago the ticket was running on Republicans, Sears isn't doing any of those things. She's mostly on cultural issues and mostly doing the Trump playbook from last year. Elections always have to be current and running on this year. But really in Virginia, the reason you're going to have delegate seats lost, the reason the ticket's going to lose is because Trump has always lost in Virginia and caused other Republicans to lose and bring the whole ticket down because his policies have been harmful to Virginia. And we're seeing that, just in a big way this year. Bigger than any time that I in the past 8 years, much worse than in the first Trump administration.
The country is really looking at this race as almost a sneak peek for the midterms next year. Is this giving any indication about what the midterms are going to look like and what messaging you want Republicans to run on?
Well, I remember, I go far back to, having supported George Allen in the midterm in 93, and obviously that helped in 94. I was on the ballot as a delegate in 2009 with Bob McDonnell, which did obviously portend for a great 2010 for Republicans. Bob McDonnell won by a big margin. So this has, been usually a good indicator. Now, it didn't work well for Republicans in 2022, because even though Glenn Youngkin won in 2021, I would remind people initially when he won his primary, he was not endorsed by Trump and he did not seek the endorsement. And even when he won the primary, Trump never appeared with him in the general election. And while Trump did endorse him, Youngkin really ran on his own. He had his own money, he had his own message. He did not run as a Trump Republican. His links to Trump only came later after he won. So he ran as his own man and he won as his own man. But in 2022, you had all these candidates that came in and ran on the Trump message. And that's when Republicans massively underperformed in 2022 because all those Trumpers, whether it was Herschel Walker down in Georgia or, the people, Dixon in Michigan and Kerry Lake in Arizona, all those Trumpers went down in flames. And we underperformed in the House. Even though they won, they underperformed massively from the expectations, even at a time when the economy and the wind was at the back of Republicans and they should have gained many more seats. So the Trump effect was really hurt them in gaining seats. So that, again, Trump has been good for himself when he's on the ballot, but he hasn't been good for anyone else, particularly in Virginia and in swing states. And next year, I mean, that's why I think you see him scrambling to, do this redistricting and cheating and trying to change the mail-in ballots, because when he's at 38%, 37%, he's underwater on all these issues. You can't be winning the midterms on the current table that they have when you only have a 3-seat majority, and you have people like Don Bacon retiring, and I think you're going to see more retirements. That's why they have to now try and change the seats in a way that will help them. But now that's starting off a scramble in California and New York, which I think is very unfortunate, because it's really better if we debate the issues and run on the issues instead of trying to, cheat on turnout. And I mean, listen, Virginia, we lost when Trump was in office on lines that we had drawn as Republicans. We lost that majority from 66 or 7 to 47 when we drew those lines, because Trump was that bad of an effect. And I think, there's nothing that can help when you have an unpopular president, no matter how much you try and, no matter how much. I had more money than my opponent. People literally were walking by me saying, listen, Barbara, I like you. You've actually done a good job. I like a lot of the things you've done, but I've got to send a message to Trump. And I literally was voted against by a lot of people who liked me, but wanted to have Democrats in charge to send a message to Trump. The midterms are always a message on Trump. Not that Democrats don't have a lot of problems of their own, but I think New Jersey and Virginia will, moderate candidates winning, which I expect they will, should be a message to the Democratic Party. Find moderate, good, sensible candidates. Roy Cooper in North Carolina, sensible people like that. And you have a chance to make a comeback. But Republicans should also learn from that. Get sensible candidates. Do not run these nuts that you're running. And look, that Michael Whatley down in North Carolina, all he is a, Trump wannabe. He's just going to be whatever Trump wants him to be. And now you're having the same problem in Georgia. Instead of, you had good candidates like Governor Kemp pass. In New Hampshire, we've had good candidates like Governor Sununu pass, because they aren't Trump replicas, they're passing. And then you're going to get these Trump bots that will run and lose in states that would be winnable for Republicans. So our Republican legacy is saying, listen, what we need is to get people, Republicans who can stand on their own 2 feet, aren't afraid to be a little different, and be their own men, their own women. People like Kelly Ayotte, Kelly Ayotte just vetoed a book banning bill. What's wrong with doing that? In most places, Republicans would be afraid to do that. Governor Abbott would be scared to death to do that. And listen, you've got Ken Paxton down there just trying to do whatever Trump wants, and now he's primarying John Cornyn and putting a Republican seat in danger. That's what's hurting the party, is we don't have people who will stand up and be their own person and say when they think something is wrong that Trump is doing, which there's a lot of things that are wrong that he's doing. We need a Congress. We need a Congress that's actually doing the role of Congress. Congress is, I don't even know why a lot of these people are even running again and are there, because they just have handed over everything to him. They are letting him impound money that's supposed to go to their constituents, to their states, things that they voted for, cancer grants for their states, for their universities. He's letting them run roughshod over bills that they voted for, that they championed. And then he says, I'm not going to enforce the bills or even let the money be spent that you appropriated. And they just roll over. What's the point of having a Republican Congress if they're not going to do even, stand up for the bills that they've passed?
Based on what you learned then, do you think it would be beneficial for Republican candidates in the midterms to more than distance themselves from Trump, say, I'm running as a Republican, this is a big tent party, I'm an anti-Trump Republican? I mean, does that messaging work?
No, well, right now, Trump makes that impossible. If you try and do that, they will go after you and you will either lose your primary, they will lose, or you'll lose in the general election. So Trump doesn't care about the party. If you aren't with him, he wants you to lose. So that's unfortunately a very difficult thing to do in Congress. I think it's something that's easier done on the gubernatorial level, on the state level. But right now, Trump would rather lose than be, than have somebody who is not his, sycophant. That's basically how he has set things up within Congress. So that is the problem. And that's what makes it so difficult. And that's why he's going to the extremes of redistricting states, because they don't really care. They probably don't care that California and New York are going to lose their moderates. They'd rather have more red state extreme people so that then you'll have, more extreme people who will just go along with him rather than have to worry about any of these moderates that might bring balance to the party. He just wants people who salute when he says jump.
Congresswoman Barbara Comstock, I appreciate your perspective here today. I hope we can have more conversations as we get closer to this race, as well as the state of the Republican Party overall. You are also the chair of our Republican Legacy. Thank you so much for joining me. You're welcome back anytime.
Thank you.